So for this installment of the project management guide, we're going to do another 2-for-1 because again, these are starting to just overlap a whole ton, and we've covered pretty much the basic concepts of what some of these other methodologies are already talking about. So between that and these particular two are basically the same thing. Like there's like an evolution when it comes to these. So in particular, it just makes more sense to do a 2-for-1 with this group. So in this installment, we're going to go basically over the critical path method and what you can call an enhanced version of that. Now, I've studied the critical path method before. I'm sure many people, business students, maybe engineering students, if anything, I'm certain of it, have studied the critical path method. But when I studied it in school, while it was part of my business schooling, it was not framed as like project management. It was actually dubbed an engineering course. So I think it was business engineering or something like that. But yeah, it was more of an engineering concept. So I'm just now realizing it's a project management methodology in itself, or I guess you can say a technique that's used when it comes to planning and scheduling out certain steps when you're carrying on a project. So either way, is the critical path is the longest path that a certain chain of events can take. The critical detail when it comes to this is it's meant to contain and encompass all business or project critical tasks or steps that you connect together and say, what's the longest amount of time that this step can take? And you do that for every step of the process until you figure out what's the absolute most amount of time that this project, or I guess this section of a project, should take, as long as we include these tasks that can't be avoided. This is also useful because it allows you to identify certain dependencies in those chain of tasks and responsibilities. And when I say dependencies, again, things like parent child. We can't do anything until this other team does something. Or I can't do my job that my manager's coming to me about and saying, hey, what's going on with you? Why aren't you done XYZ? And I say, I can't do anything until this person on this team does it, or this teammate on our team does it, or maybe you yourself, manager, have to do something that's holding me up. That's what I mean by dependencies. You are able to identify parts of your workload that literally cannot move forward, or maybe it would be best for them to not move forward until a certain step before it is already complete. Because sometimes you can run 2 or 3 different tasks concurrently or at the same time. But when it comes to business critical tasks, you usually, or at least the general concept, is to knock out one before you go into the other so that everything runs smoothly. That's the reason the critical path method is known to be very long. The critical path itself is supposed to be the longest route that a project can take or a chain of events can take, so that you know what's that like most amount of time that this should take. And then anything past this, we're probably looking at some need to readjust certain resources, placements, workers, and whatnot that are assisting with the project. The second methodology that we'll go over, and again, it's more of a technique than anything, which I said was like an evolution of the critical path method, is what's called the critical chain method. So the whole thing with the critical path method is that while it does give you an idea of how long a certain chain of events should take, it's only an idea. It's only a theory. It's not really proven. And the main weakness when it comes to the critical path method is it's not necessarily tethered to reality. That's where the evolution of it, the critical chain method, comes into play. If you want to get results that are a little more realistic and get a more realistic idea of how long something's supposed to take, you want to use the critical chain method over the critical path method. The critical path may give you the best picture of how long this absolutely should take, but the critical chain will actually take in other details into consideration when you're trying to paint this picture and schedule certain parts of a project. One of the details that critical chain method would take into account versus the critical path would not, where the critical path would not, is, for example, resource constraints or resource limitations. We kind of talked about this in a different video where if you have money, time itself is a resource, people, of course, your workers and people doing the hands-on work for the project, analysts, developers, and whatnot, all of these are resources that are vital to the completion, especially timely and under certain financial constraints of that project. These are all very important when it comes to completing the project. But the thing is, sometimes people, even outside of project management, just as a general, line of work, just general concept of work, leaders, management, whatnot, sometimes we come across people that just they don't necessarily adjust and they don't take into consideration resource constraints, which again, if you were apply to people, would be burnout. burnout is what would could be considered in the business sense a resource constraint or resource limitation, because there's only so much you can push people to work, whether it's optional overtime or mandatory overtime in addition to their regular schedule. Maybe they have other projects with different teams they're working on at the same time, right? These are all things you need to take into consideration. So when you're using the critical path method and you're just trying to get the longest amount or the longest route to completion for this project, you're not taking in, for example, the people that would be doing that work and certain details or constraints that could affect them and therefore affect the work of the project. That's where the critical chain method comes into play, because it'll actually take that in consideration. It'll take in the weekly work hour restraints. It may take in changing conditions, such as this person being on vacation at the moment, maybe have a family emergency, or they may even be able to think about what if something just goes wrong at the drop of a dime with any member or a group of members on the team. Critical chain is more likely to encompass those type of details as well as time constraints and financial constraints. But the critical path doesn't do that. It's just a black and white picture. So again, just to summarize, if you want to figure out, if you have like a list of tasks, like a grocery list type thing, and you just want to figure out what exactly is the longest amount of time it should take for me to complete all of these tasks, like at its absolute highest amount of time, then you want to use the critical path method. And that's when you're just trying to figure out the highest amount of time. You're not really looking to adjust. You're not really looking for a bigger picture versus the critical chain. You want more of a complete picture. You want to give someone, if you need to give it to your manager or any other stakeholders, you want to give them the results of using the critical chain method, because you may say that a phase of a project or an entire project may have to last 3 months, but you'll also take into consideration the amount of workers you have, the weekly or bi-weekly hourly constraints when it comes to how long they can work. You may have a better idea of the financial constraints, especially if you've already planned things out, or if you already have an idea of the resources you're going to need to complete this project, whether it's a software-based project. So the developers will be pretty key in that, versus it might be acquisition of physical materials, whether it's wood, plastics, and whatnot, certain threads and textiles, all that stuff. That's where the critical chain method is very useful and will actually take those details to consideration. So the final result is more lifelike and it's more literal, versus critical path. It's not too literal, so it's a little easier to dismiss. But I'm going to leave that here, guys. It was a pretty quick one. If you have any feedback or questions for me, share that with me in the comment section below. I'll see you guys in the next video. Later.